Recently adapted into a Netflix TV series and the 2015 winner of science fiction's most prestigious award, the Hugo for Best Novel, The Three Body Problem is a bona fide global success. But is it good? The Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu is the first entry in the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. It was originally published in Chinese in 2008, and the English translation wasn't published until 2014. I can't overstate what a huge success this book has been. It has sold more copies than around the globe than any other Chinese literary export, as in no other book originally published in Chinese and written in China has sold more copies internationally than The Three Body Problem. It's also won science fiction's most prestigious award, and it's been praised by critics and fans, with one of its most famous fans being President Barack Obama, who described the series as wildly imaginative, a quote that is now used on the book jacket of every copy of every installment in the trilogy. Incidentally, I don't think wildly imaginative is obviously a compliment. I could imagine a teacher saying that to a student if the student turned in a really crazy short story and the teacher was just desperate for some sort of non-negative feedback to give. And so the teacher goes, "Well, Billy, it was wildly imaginative." But no, I've read the entire interview that quote comes from with President Obama, and he is indeed a big fan of the trilogy. I just think it's funny that they chose wildly imaginative as the encapsulation of his praise. So massive commercial success, fans all around the globe, and I do not like it. I don't think The Three Body Problem is a particularly good book, nor do I think it's a particularly good work of science fiction. Now, that criticism and this review is very specific to this book. I am just talking about The Three Body Problem, the first book in the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. I actually like the second book, The Dark Forest, significantly more. But this review is about The Three Body Problem, and I just don't think The Three Body Problem is that good. And I'm not making this review to try to yuck anybody's yum. If you love this book, awesome. I am not saying you're wrong to like it. What I am saying is, if you're out there in the world and you're just a reader, and maybe you like science fiction, or you're getting into science fiction, and it's like, hey, here's a book that there's a ton of buzz about. Is this good? Is this worth my time? My opinion is, I just don't think that it is. Because, first of all, it's a little bit boring. It's pretty slow in its pacing. And for a science fiction book, this does not cover a lot of ground. It is set primarily on Earth in the early 2000s, and it's just standard Earth 2000s era technology. There is eventually one piece of alien technology involved, and there's also a virtual reality video game that the characters dip into from time to time, and that's kind of a little more of a fantastic world. But this book is just a series of people on Earth in the 2000s going from one room to another, having intense discussions about what's going on. For that reason, I would describe this work of science fiction as a mystery more than anything. It's definitely not an action, and I wouldn't really, maybe you could argue it's a little bit of a drama, but primarily it is a very slow-paced first contact story that plays out like a mystery, in that the impetus is not what's going to happen, it's what's going on. You're spending your book investing with your protagonist is the one going from room to room and talking to all these experts about all these things, and then he's exploring the virtual reality game, and he's meeting people and having these conversations, and the protagonist is trying to find out what is going on, or is kind of being dragged along in the process of all the governments from around the world trying to find out what's going on. Once they find out what's going on, they have time to take some action, and then we're out, the book ends. So a lot of what you think of when you think sci-fi is not in this book. It's normal people, normal technology, and then the gradual introduction of some sci-fi ideas. The second book goes on to be wildly different. The second book suddenly jumps into an almost like pulp sci-fi type thing where you're jumping hundreds of years into the future and there's space battles and all this stuff. But that's not this book. In fact, the first two books are so different from each other that just like I didn't really care for the first book, but I liked the second book significantly more, what I've found is a lot of fans of the first book don't really like the second book that much. Themes. One thing that I think is engaging about this book, but I would argue ultimately amounts to a negative, are the themes of the book. The author Liu grew up in a very difficult time. He was born in Beijing, but his life was uprooted as the Cultural Revolution played out, and members of his extended family took varying sides, and ultimately it ended up in Liu's parents getting assigned to work in a rural coal mine, and then Liu being sent to live with his grandparents for safekeeping. That is a tough and harrowing background to come from, and Three Body Problem is at its best when it is kind of dipping into that background. There is a central character in the book whose life is deeply and tragically affected by the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And those paragraphs, that portion of the book is incredibly engaging and really interesting. And as a Westerner who knows woefully little about Chinese history, I was utterly fascinated by those parts of the story. The Chinese Cultural Revolution looms large over the Three Body Problem, and how its characters and its author views the human species. And for those reasons, I would say that a central theme of the Three Body Problem is nihilism, not Russian Revolution, like violent nihilism, but more like the Nietzsche-esque sense of nihilism, that it is a good thing that we be disillusioned of our faith in God or human institutions like governments, and instead our endurance will come from technological progress and our will to endure free of illusion. It's bleak, man. There is a pervasive assumption in this series, not unique to this series at all. In fact, I would say this is the norm in contemporary sci-fi. There is a pervasive assumption that the human species will be inferior to the other alien species that occupy the cosmos, and not just technologically inferior, but morally inferior, in the sense of less able to steward and be responsible for its resources and its people. There is an assumption that our systems of government are backwards, that our culture is backwards, that moral progress and technological progress are somewhat inexplicably intertwined, such that all more advanced species will also be more advanced in a moral sense. And even moral is a dubious term to use in this context, because along with this nihilism is kind of an assumption that objective morality is not a thing. And instead, especially in this series, it's just about the laws of nature. It's about species fighting for survival. And there's not good, there's not bad. There's just, do you survive or do you perish? And that kind of bums me out. Like, that is not a theme that I want to spend thousands of pages dwelling on. So my thoughts on the Three Body Problem: I've already made it clear that this book isn't my cup of tea. But let me tell you why. First of all, Liu is an author who, at least in this series, is not interested in characters. And I am a reader who is all about characters. I one day will make a video explaining my ranking system and the rubric I use, which is a series of weighted categories. My most heavily weighted category is character. I, as a reader, care a lot about well-rounded characters who grow and evolve throughout a story. And that's where that I get invested in a book. I get invested in characters. Liu is not an author who develops characters. Characters are, it reminds me of what Charles Dickens is accused of, that his characters are just like stock characters and caricatures. And depending on the Dickens book we're talking about, that is more or less true at times. However, I think when Dickens uses caricatures, he does so to make a larger point about human nature, whereas I would argue that Liu just doesn't. Liu uses two-dimensional characters because he doesn't care about the characters, he cares about the plot. He doesn't You're not going to read Liu's work because you care a lot about John or Jane. You're going to read Liu's work because you're excited about his ideas, because you're excited about these grand, cosmic hypotheses and, speculating about the fate of the universe and the evolution of technology and all of that. Our main character in the present is utterly forgettable and purely meant to be a stand-in for the reader. The protagonist in the present only exists for the reader to have an excuse to be in the room where the experts and politicians are discussing what's going on and how to handle the mysterious happenings around the world. So who is this book for? This is where the harshness of my review comes in. This is why I have been so brutal about this book. Since finishing this book and this series, I have recommended it to no one. I have plenty of readers in my life who love science fiction. In fact, amongst my family and friends, the most loved genre is probably science fiction. And yet, there's not one person in my life I've recommended this book to. And that's because I don't think that if you're hankering for like a science fiction action book, the Three Body Problem is definitely not it. You could argue the later installments scratch that itch more, but not the Three Body Problem. That's not the type of book it is. It's slow pacing and exploration of ideas makes it feel a bit more like hard sci-fi, but I wouldn't recommend it to lovers of hard sci-fi either, because I don't think they would find this book sufficiently dense with ideas to justify its length. Not that it's particularly long. I'm just saying I think this could have been significantly shorter, given that it's really only interested in exploring 2 or 3 major concepts, and those concepts are explored primarily in the form of very gradual reveals. I imagine this book is best suited for someone who is a bit of like a science or physics buff. The way some people are history buffs, I think this is a book that would be more up the alley of a science buff. Someone who loves like reading about physics and hypothetical physics and just, thinking about science and its future and ideas, because Liu does, introduce and explain some fun science concepts that are real, that exist in the real world, that real scientists really discuss and have, hypothesized about. He loves little diversions into explaining the three-body problem, for example, a very specific physics problem. And so in those moments, that's where I feel this book is unique and separating itself from other works of science fiction, when it's just kind of dealing with some semi-real world science and, explaining it in a fun way that has meaningful value and utility within the plot. However, the prose are very bland. This book is translated. So it is not a criticism of Liu's writing to say that the prose are bland. I can't read the original. However, for the translation I read, bland, very functional prose. You are just explaining what's happening. And since it is slowly paced, not that much is happening. My rating is 3 out of 10 bicorns. It seems a little devastating because this does have some really fun and original ideas, but it's the worst thing a book can be. It's boring. I don't want to leave without talking about this cover. I'm going to stick with what apparently is a theme. I feel the opposite way about the cover that I do about the book. I didn't particularly like this book, so of course I love this cover. I don't know, but to me, the pyramid, that's just great. When you have a work of science fiction and there's a pyramid on the cover, that juxtaposition is so great. We're talking about the future, but for some reason there's a pyramid on the cover. So what is going on? I think it's an immediately intriguing thing. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like the idea of a YouTube channel dedicated to reviewing fiction of all genres, please consider subscribing. I upload a new review every Sunday. And if you like this video, please throw it a like, because the AI decides what we all see, but it lets us vote.